The dust hung in the air like a judgment as Margaret stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known, watching her father nail boards across the bedroom window that had been hers since childhood. Her mother sat in the rocking chair behind her, silent as stone, her hands folded in her lap as though in prayer, though Margaret knew better. Those hands were folded in finality, not supplication. "You're no daughter of mine," her father had said that morning, his voice carrying the weight of scripture and social expectation. 3 years married and nothing to show for it. "You've shamed this family, shamed the Campbell name. Dr. Morrison says you're barren as the salt flats. And I won't have a cursed woman under my roof." Margaret had tried to explain that her husband, Thomas, had died only 6 months after their wedding, thrown from a spooked horse during a lightning storm, that there had barely been time to even hope for a child. But her father's mind was made up, hardened by the whispers of the neighboring ranches, by the pitying looks from the women at church, by the shame he felt every time someone asked about grandchildren that would never come. She had $20 sewn into the hem of her dress. Her mother's wedding ring slipped to her in secret the night before, and a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, and a Bible she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The morning coach to Redemption Springs would arrive in an hour, and Margaret Campbell, 24 years old and newly orphaned by choice rather than death, would be on it. The town of Redemption Springs earned its name from the natural spring that bubbled up in the center of the settlement, water so pure and cold it was said to wash away sins. Margaret thought that was a generous interpretation. The town looked like every other frontier settlement she had passed through, all weathered wood and broken promises, where hope came to die slowly under the relentless prairie sun. She found work at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman whose husband had died building the railroad 20 years prior. Mrs. Chen asked no questions about Margaret's past, about the absence of a husband, or the haunted look in her eyes. She simply showed her to a small room under the eaves and put her to work changing linens and serving meals to the miners and ranch hands who rented rooms by the week. The work was hard, the kind that left her hands raw and her back aching, but Margaret welcomed it. Physical pain was easier to bear than the hollow ache of rejection, the knowledge that her own blood had found her wanting. She kept to herself, spoke when spoken to, and tried not to think about the future stretching before her like an empty road with no destination in sight. It was 3 months before she first met James Cordell, though she had heard his name spoken often enough in the boarding house dining room. He owned the Double C Ranch, 10,000 acres of grassland and trouble, according to the men who worked for him. They spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness, the way one might speak of a wounded animal, dangerous but somehow deserving of pity. He came into town on a Tuesday, his horse tied outside the general store while he collected supplies. Margaret was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the boarding house when she first saw him, a tall man with shoulders broad as an axe handle, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. His clothes were clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of a life without a woman's regular attention. What struck her most were his eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and distant, holding a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He caught her staring and tipped his hat, a gesture of politeness that seemed to cost him effort, then turned and walked into the store without a word. "That's James Cordell," Mrs. Chen said from the doorway behind her. "Good man, sad man. His wife died 4 years back, childbirth, baby too. Some men never recover from that kind of loss." Margaret understood more than Mrs. Chen could know. Loss was a language she had become fluent in. Whether through death or abandonment, the grammar was much the same. She didn't expect to see him again, but Redemption Springs was a small town, and paths crossed whether you wanted them to or not. He came to the boarding house for Sunday supper 2 weeks later, taking a seat alone at the corner table, where he could watch the room without being part of it. Margaret served him roast chicken and potatoes, her hands steady despite the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice rough as gravel, as though he didn't use it often enough to keep it smooth. She nodded and moved to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You're new in town." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. 3 months now. "You settling here or just passing through?" She considered the question. Was anywhere home for someone like her, unwanted and unmoored? "I haven't decided yet." He studied her for a long moment. And Margaret had the unsettling feeling that he saw more than she wanted to reveal. "Sometimes a place chooses you instead of the other way around," he said finally, then turned his attention to his meal, effectively dismissing her. She thought about his words for days afterward, turning them over in her mind like smooth stones. Did places choose people, or was that just another pretty lie to make sense of the randomness of life? The answer came in an unexpected way. Mrs. Chen fell ill in early November. A fever that laid her low and left the boarding house in chaos. Margaret took over the running of the place without being asked, managing the meals and the cleaning, and the accounts with a competence that surprised even herself. She discovered she had a head for numbers and an eye for details that had never been called upon in her father's house. James Cordell came by during that time, bringing firewood without being asked, fixing a broken step on the back porch, helping to calm a drunk miner who got aggressive one night. He did these things quietly, without expectation of thanks, then disappeared back to his ranch as though he had never been there at all. When Mrs. Chen recovered, she called Margaret into her small sitting room and poured tea with hands that still trembled slightly. "You could have left," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "When I got sick, you could have taken whatever money was in the cash box and disappeared. No one would have blamed you. But you stayed and you took care of everything, took care of me. Why?" Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm teacup and searched for words that would make sense. "Because you gave me a place when I had none. Because kindness deserves kindness in return. Because," she paused, surprised by the truth of what she was about to say. "Because this feels like the closest thing to home I've had in a long time." Mrs. Chen nodded, her dark eyes knowing. "James Cordell asked about you. Wanted to know if you were honest, if you were kind, if you were the sort of woman who runs when things get hard." Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're all those things and more. That you've been hurt by people who should have protected you, and that you're still learning to trust again." Mrs. Chen reached across and patted her hand. "He's a good man, Margaret. Lonely and sad, but good. He needs someone, though he's too stubborn to admit it. And you, I think, need someone who will see your worth, instead of what you cannot give." Margaret wanted to protest, to say that she wasn't looking for another husband, another chance to fail at being what someone needed. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere deep inside, in a place she had tried to wall off with disappointment and resignation, a small flame of hope flickered to life. Winter came hard that year, blowing down from the mountains with a fury that caught everyone off guard. The boarding house stayed full of men seeking warmth and hot meals, and Margaret worked from dawn until long after dark, falling into bed too exhausted to dream. She barely noticed when James Cordell stopped coming to Sunday suppers, though she found herself looking for him despite her better judgment. It was Mrs. Chen who told her he was snowed in at the ranch, that the storm had hit his property particularly hard, and he was struggling to keep his cattle alive and his ranch hands from deserting. 2 of his men did leave, deciding the pay wasn't worth freezing to death on the open range, which left him dangerously short-handed. Margaret listened to the updates from travelers and felt an unfamiliar anxiety growing in her chest. She told herself it was simple human concern, that she would worry about anyone facing such hardship. But late at night, when the wind howled around the boarding house and shook the windows in their frames, she found herself whispering into the dark, hoping somehow that the gray-eyed rancher was safe from the storm. The thaw came in late February, sudden and violent, turning the frozen ground into a sea of mud and the creek into a raging torrent. James Cordell rode into town on the first clear day, his horse gaunt and his face haggard with exhaustion. He went directly to the land office, then to the bank, and Margaret heard the whispers spreading through town like wildfire. He was in trouble. The winter had killed half his herd, and without ranch hands to help with the spring calving, he was facing ruin. The bank was calling in his loan, and he had 30 days to come up with the money or lose everything his grandfather had built. Margaret found him sitting alone in the boarding house dining room, long after the supper service had ended, staring at a cold cup of coffee as though it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. She refilled his cup without asking and sat down across from him, breaking her own rule about fraternizing with the guests. "I'm sorry about your troubles," she said quietly. He looked up, and she saw raw desperation in his eyes before he shuttered it away. "News travels fast in a small town." "It does. Is there anything that can be done?" He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Unless you know where I can find $3,000 and half a dozen ranch hands who'll work for promises and prayer. I'm afraid I'm finished." Margaret thought of her $20, long since spent on necessities, and saved again coin by coin from her wages. She thought of her mother's ring, still hidden in the toe of her spare boot, the only thing of value she owned in the world. She thought of the empty years stretching ahead, of the life of service and solitude she had resigned herself to. And then she thought of something else entirely. "What if you had a wife?" she asked, the words coming out before she could guess them. James stared at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. "What, a wife? The bank wants security, proof that you're stable and settled. The town wants to see you're not just a grieving widower, letting everything fall apart. And you need someone to help run the ranch, to cook and keep house and manage the accounts while you focus on rebuilding the herd. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" His voice was carefully neutral, but something flickered in those storm cloud eyes. Margaret lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I'm suggesting a practical arrangement. I can cook and clean and manage a household. I can keep books and stretch a dollar further than you'd think possible. I'm strong and I'm not afraid of hard work. And," she swallowed hard, forcing herself to say the words, "I can't give you children. So you wouldn't have to worry about that complication." The silence stretched between them, heavy as the snow that had nearly buried them all. Margaret watched a dozen emotions cross James Cordell's face, too fast to identify, before he leaned back in his chair and studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Why would you do this?" he asked finally. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "Because I'm tired of being alone," she said simply. "Because I'm tired of feeling like damaged goods that no one wants. Because maybe we could help each other. Two broken people making something that works, even if it's not what we dreamed of." He was quiet for so long she thought he would refuse, thought she had humiliated herself for nothing. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in his calloused palm, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his skin. "I don't need heirs," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need someone who'll stand with me when everything's falling apart. Someone who won't run when things get hard. Mrs. Chen says you're that kind of woman. Are you?" Margaret thought of her family's rejection, of the long, lonely months of rebuilding herself piece by piece. She thought of all the things she couldn't give, and all the things she could. And she thought of those gray eyes looking at her not with pity, but with something that might, given time, become respect, and maybe even affection. "I am," she said firmly. "I'm exactly that kind of woman." They were married 3 days later in a ceremony so simple it was almost stark. Chen stood as witness, along with the minister and his wife. Margaret wore her best dress, and James wore his Sunday suit, and they spoke vows that felt more like a business contract than a declaration of love. But when he slipped a simple gold band on her finger and kissed her cheek with careful courtesy, Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years. The ranch was worse than she had imagined. The house needed repairs, the barn was half collapsed, and everywhere she looked she saw evidence of a man who had been slowly giving up. But she also saw potential, the bones of something that could be good again with work and time and determination. She started with the house, cleaning and organizing and making lists of what needed fixing. James watched her with wary surprise, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real and might disappear if he looked away. She cooked simple, hearty meals that he ate with an appreciation that suggested he'd been surviving on hardtack and coffee for months. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about the past at first. That was too raw, too painful for either of them to touch. Instead, they talked about the ranch, about what needed doing and how to do it. Margaret proved her worth with the account books, finding errors and inefficiencies that had been costing him money he couldn't afford to lose. She wrote letters to cattlemen her father had known, calling in favors she had no right to claim, and managed to secure credit for new stock that would arrive in the spring. James, for his part, threw himself into the physical work with renewed energy. He repaired the barn, mended fences, and rode out before dawn to check on the surviving cattle. And in the evenings, he would sit by the fire, while Margaret read aloud from books she found in the house, his late wife's collection gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. It was during one of those evenings, 2 months into their marriage, that James finally spoke of Sarah. She wanted a big family, he said quietly, staring into the flames. 5 or 6 children, she used to say. Boys to help run the ranch and girls to fill the house with laughter. She was so happy when she found out she was expecting. His voice broke, and he cleared his throat roughly. I never even got to hold the baby. They were both gone before I could tell them goodbye. Margaret set down her book and moved to sit beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it with her whole heart. I blamed myself for a long time, he continued. Thought maybe if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, or if we'd gone to town instead of trying to deliver at the ranch, or if I'd been a better husband, a better man. I carried that guilt until it nearly buried me. It wasn't your fault, Margaret said firmly. Death comes when it comes, and all the guilt in the world won't change that. Believe me, I know. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and asked the question she had been dreading. Why did your family cast you out? So she told him. About Thomas and the 2, brief marriage. About the doctor's pronouncement that she would never bear children. About her father's shame and her mother's silent complicity. She told him about the loneliness and the fear, about feeling like a failure at the one thing women were supposed to do. And when she finished, she felt lighter somehow, as though speaking the truth out loud had taken away some of its power to hurt her. James was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Your father was a fool, he said, and I'm grateful for it. Because if he hadn't been, you wouldn't be here. And I need you here, Margaret. Not for children or heirs, or to fulfill some expectation. I need you because you make the loneliness bearable. Because you see the work that needs doing, and you just do it without complaint. Because when I come home, there's light in the windows and warmth in the house. And for the first time in 4 years, it feels like a home instead of a tomb. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built around her heart to protect herself from more hurt. She turned to him and saw in his eyes not pity or disappointment but simple, honest appreciation for who she was exactly as she was. I need you too, she whispered. Not as a husband in name only, but as a partner. As someone who sees my worth instead of my failings. He cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her, and this time it wasn't courteous or careful. It was real and raw and full of all the lonely years they had both endured. And when they went to bed that night, it was together in the true sense of the word, 2 damaged people reaching for each other in the darkness and finding something that felt like healing. The spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle they had purchased arrived, and with them came a handful of ranch hands willing to work for a boss who treated them fairly. Margaret discovered she had a talent for managing people, for organizing work crews and planning meals, and making sure supplies were ordered before they ran out. The ranch began to run smoothly again, efficiently, and James began to smile more often. They worked side by side through the long days, and slowly the ranch came back to life. Fences were mended, buildings repaired, and the sound of cattle lowing in the fields became a source of pride rather than worry. Margaret planted a garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil, and James built her a chicken coop so they could have fresh eggs. But it was the small moments that meant the most. The way James would bring her wildflowers from the range, awkward and endearing in his attempts at romance. The way Margaret would pack extra food in his saddlebag for the long days, tucking in notes that made him laugh. The way they would sit on the porch in the evenings, his arm around her shoulders, watching the sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. They were building something together, not just a ranch but a life. And if it wasn't the life either of them had imagined when they were young and full of dreams, it was something better because it was real and earned and chosen. The first letter arrived in July, forwarded through 3 different towns before finding its way to the Double C Ranch. Margaret's hands shook as she recognized her mother's handwriting, and for a moment she considered throwing it in the fire unread. But James was watching her with those knowing gray eyes, and she found the courage to open it. Her father was dead, a heart attack that had taken him suddenly one morning while he was working in the barn. Her mother was alone now, struggling to maintain the ranch with only one hired hand, and she was writing to ask if Margaret would consider coming home, if she could find it in her heart to forgive. Margaret read the letter twice, then handed it to James without a word. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening as he progressed through her mother's carefully worded plea. "What do you want to do?" he asked when he finished. Margaret looked around the ranch house, at the curtains she had sewn, and the furniture they had repaired together, at the life they had built from nothing but determination and faith in each other. Then she looked at James, at the man who had given her a place when she had none, who had seen her worth when her own family could not. "I want to write her back," she said slowly. "I want to tell her that I forgive her, because holding on to anger only hurts the one carrying it. But I also want to tell her that my home is here now, with my husband, and I have no intention of leaving it." James pulled her close, and she felt the tension leave his body. "I was afraid you'd want to go back," he admitted. "Afraid I'd lose you just when I'd found you." "You won't lose me?" Margaret said firmly. "I made vows to you, and I meant them. For better or worse, this is where I belong." She wrote the letter that evening, choosing her words carefully. She told her mother she was sorry for her loss, that she understood grief and loneliness better than anyone. She sent money to help with expenses and offered to find a buyer for the ranch if her mother wanted to move to town. But she also made it clear that her life was here now, that she had found purpose and partnership, and something that might even be called happiness. Her mother's response came 6 weeks later, shorter this time but warmer. She understood, she wrote. She had always understood, even when she had lacked the courage to speak up against her husband's judgment. She was proud of Margaret, proud of what she had built, and she hoped that someday they might see each other again under better circumstances. Margaret tucked the letter away in the drawer of her dresser, next to the one photograph she had of Thomas. She was done living in the past, done letting other people's expectations define her worth. She was Margaret Cordell now, rancher's wife and partner, and she had work to do. The autumn brought their first real test. A neighboring rancher tried to claim a portion of their land, arguing that James had let the property lapse during his years of grief, and it was now open range. It was a legal battle they could ill afford, but Margaret refused to back down. She rode into town and hired a lawyer, presented documentation she had meticulously organized, and fought with a fierceness that surprised everyone, including herself. They won, but it cost them most of their savings and earned them an enemy in Jacob Thornton, the rancher who had tried to steal their land. James worried about retaliation, but Margaret refused to live in fear. "We've survived worse than a bitter neighbor," she told him one night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We survived our own grief and loneliness. We survived a winter that nearly killed us both. We can survive this too. And they did. Through hard work and careful management. Through supporting each other when times got tough and celebrating together when they succeeded. The ranch prospered, and so did they. 2 years after their wedding, James surprised her by bringing home a young girl from town, an orphan whose mother had died of fever and whose father had disappeared. Her name was Lucy, and she was 8 years old with eyes too old for her face and a wariness that Margaret recognized. "I thought," James said, suddenly uncertain. "I thought maybe we could give her a home. If you want to. I know we said no children, but she needs someone, and we have room, and—" Margaret stopped his rambling with a kiss. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, of course we'll take her." Lucy was difficult at first, testing boundaries and expecting rejection. But Margaret was patient, and James was kind, and slowly the girl began to believe that this home was real, that these people wouldn't cast her out when she proved inconvenient or imperfect. It was Lucy who finally called them Mama and Papa, 6 months after coming to live at the ranch. She said it casually, asking Margaret to pass the potatoes at dinner, and the word hung in the air like a benediction. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and James had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. That night, after Lucy was asleep, James held Margaret while she cried, finally releasing years of grief for the children she would never bear. "She's not mine by blood," Margaret whispered, "but she's mine by choice. We're hers by choice. Isn't that better somehow?" "It's perfect," James said, and meant it. "We're a family not because we have to be, but because we choose to be." Every single day, 5 years after Margaret had stood on her father's porch and watched him nail boards over her window, she stood on her own porch, watching the sun rise over land she had helped save, watching her husband teach their daughter to ride a horse, watching the life they had built together unfold in all its imperfect beauty. She thought about the girl she had been, broken and rejected and certain she had nothing left to offer the world. She thought about the man who had said he didn't need heirs, who had seen her worth when no one else could. And she thought about the family they had created, not through blood but through choice and love, and the quiet determination to build something good from broken pieces. A letter had arrived that morning from her mother, who was living comfortably in town, now with a small pension from the sale of the ranch. She wrote often, full of pride for the daughter she had failed to protect, but who had thrived despite it all. She wanted to visit in the spring, to meet her granddaughter and see the life Margaret had created. Margaret had already written back with an invitation, offering forgiveness that came easier now, that she understood how fear and social pressure could make cowards of even good people. She was done with bitterness, done with letting the past poison the present. James came up the porch steps, leaving Lucy to practice her riding in the corral. He wrapped his arms around Margaret from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, both of them watching their daughter laugh with pure joy as she urged her horse into a gentle trot. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Taking a chance on a failing ranch and a broken man." Margaret turned in his arms and looked up at the face she had come to love, at the gray eyes that had learned to smile again, at the man who had given her everything by asking for nothing except herself. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me more than a home, James. You gave me a place to belong. You gave me purpose and partnership and proof that being barren doesn't mean being empty. My father cast me out because I couldn't give him grandchildren to carry on his name. But you showed me that legacy isn't about blood. It's about the lives we touch and the love we leave behind." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Lucy called out from the corral asking them to watch her jump. They turned together to cheer her on. Two people who had found each other in their brokenness and built something whole, proving that the strongest families aren't always born, but sometimes chosen, carefully and intentionally, one brave decision at a time. The prairie wind carried the sound of Lucy's laughter across the land, and Margaret thought about the winding path that had brought her here. She had been cast out as barren, dismissed as worthless, told she had nothing to offer. But standing here on this porch, with her husband's hand in hers, and her daughter's joy filling the air, she knew the truth that her father had never understood. Worth isn't measured in what you can produce or provide. Worth is inherent, unchanging, waiting only for someone brave enough to see it and wise enough to treasure it. James had been that person for her, and she had been that person for him. Together they had created something more valuable than any bloodline or inheritance. A home built on acceptance and choice, and the stubborn refusal to let the world define their value. As the sun climbed higher in the endless prairie sky, Margaret Cordell smiled and called out encouragement to her daughter, held tight to her husband's hand, and counted herself among the richest women in the West. Not in gold or cattle or land, though they had enough of all three, but in the things that truly mattered, the things that lasted beyond a single generation, the things that made life worth living even when it got hard. She had been told she was barren, but she had grown a family from nothing but love and determination. She had been told she was worthless, but she had helped save a ranch and build a legacy. She had been told she had nothing to offer, but she had proven that sometimes the greatest gift you can give is simply yourself, exactly as you are, to someone brave enough to accept it. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.